The words of the Beatitudes are probably so familiar to us that it's worth asking ourselves what it might mean to be blessed. Some translate the word as happy, which is possibly the worst way for us to think about it, because happiness suggests a kind of state of euphoria, which, particularly in Luke's account of the Beatitudes, makes no sense in terms of the states that the Lord is describing: poverty, hunger, weeping, and persecution. And besides, we can experience moments of bliss without being happy in the world's eyes. Our translation, which we've just heard, blessed, implies that God looks with a certain goodwill or approval upon the lives of the poor, the hungry, the weeping, and the persecuted. But even this doesn't fully capture what we mean, for it's not the knowledge that God is pleased with them that makes them blessed, but rather their state of soul, who they are, what they are. Jesus tells us that these people are, despite the outward appearances, in possession of a good that others cannot obtain. While we often associate the word blessed with the Beatitudes, it appears throughout the Scriptures, most obviously in the Psalms. We had Psalm 1 today, which opens with the words, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. He's like the tree that's planted beside flowing waters, a tree which will always be in leaf. Blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who greatly delights in his commandments." This blessedness comes about because people receive divine instruction and place their trust always in the Lord. It's the same idea we have in Jeremiah in our first reading. The wise man is like a well-watered tree. The man who places his trust in things of the flesh is like a drought-benighted shrub. But we might well ask ourselves if this is always the case. Is it really the case that those instructed by God really prosper? We often think that the wisdom literature, books like Proverbs, Wisdom, Ecclesiastes, are just books in praise of wisdom, but they actually interrogate this problem, and we ourselves, if we're honest, do not have to look all that far to find examples of the wicked and the unwise prospering. We might also ask whether, if this blessedness doesn't lead to a good life, is it really good at all? Is this blessedness really worth having? In the case of the 8 Beatitudes in Matthew, their spiritual meaning makes it easier for us to think of them as a kind of state of blessing or beatitude. But in Luke's account, poverty, hunger, sadness, and persecution are harder to see as states of beatitude or blessing because they're so much more physical. One way to deal with this might be to make Luke's Beatitudes more closely align with Matthew's. We turn poverty into spiritual poverty, hunger into hungering for righteousness. And there's some truth in this, for, as St. Basil writes when he's commenting on this passage of the Gospel, it's not simply being poor, hungry, sad, or persecuted which brings us to heaven. But we shouldn't rob Luke's Beatitudes of their power by overly spiritualizing them. The Lord reverses the world's values and gives a different account of what really constitutes happiness. Our intuition that it cannot be truly good for the wicked to triumph is confirmed by the Lord in adding these series of woes to those who have this worldly success. And part of the power of these Beatitudes, the reason that they are so direct and so forceful, is that Luke places them immediately after the choice of the 12. And he directs the Beatitudes and the woes at these same disciples. Jesus looks at them and tells them clearly that their discipleship must be marked by poverty and simplicity. They must associate themselves with those who suffer, and their discipleship will have gone off track if they receive worldly praise and adulation. So while Matthew's words are directed more generally towards the wider crowd who followed the Lord's preaching ministry, Luke makes these principles of apostolic ministry. It's no surprise then that Luke's account of the Jerusalem church in Acts seems to follow this vision of the Beatitudes so closely. The Christians in Jerusalem hold all things in common, care for those who suffer, and themselves suffer persecution. No clearer indication of the woes which will fall upon the rich can be given than the fate of Ananias and Sapphira, disciples who were struck down for holding back property for themselves. The inversion of worldly categories only makes sense if Christ has been raised from the dead. The inversion of our worldly categories only makes sense in the light of that great inversion of worldly powers and ideals, that is, the Lord's death and resurrection. As St. Paul says in our second reading, if Christ hasn't been raised, then we are to be pitied. For all of this inversion, it is mere folly, it's purely meaningless. Our faith in the risen Lord should make us hear these beatitudes and these woes, and when necessary, reorientate our lives. Whenever we hear these words, they should prick our conscience, and I gently suggest that if they don't, we should perhaps listen to them more attentively. At heart, these Beatitudes offer a deeper meaning to the evangelical counsels which shape our Dominican life. But these counsels are not only lived by us, but are proposed to all of the Christian faithful to shape and model their lives. A life of simplicity and poverty, a chaste love which frees us for a wider love of all of those who are in need, and an obedience to our divine Master, who looks on us, loves us, and calls us to share his life.